Hi, this lecture is about pelagic ecosystems. For those of you who've been following the other parts of this course, we're switching now from a focus mainly on concepts and processes like primary production and secondary production, community interactions, to now focusing on specific ecosystems, particular parts of the ocean environment. And we're starting with pelagic ecosystems because they're relatively simple. You're mainly just dealing with a giant block of water and the animals in it and other organisms in it. Um, but although these ecosystems may look like they're large and expanses of sameness, there's actually a lot of interesting and complex stuff going on in this big block of blue water, and that's what we'll be learning about in this lecture today. So the pelagic environment refers to the environment that is what we call the water column. So basically, the water that's not touching the bottom. So it's the organisms that live in the pelagic environments are ones that don't have to rest on or burrow in the bottom, that are suspended in the water. And so the water column is basically from the seafloor to the surface of the ocean, and that's covers the entire ocean. Um, a lot of times, though, we tend to, when we say pelagic, we mean the environment that's sort of not only the above the bottom, but also kind of away from shore. So we mean sort of like the open sea, not including the near shore environment, the near bottom environment, and the deep sea environment. So sort of like surface waters of the open ocean are what most people think about when they think about the pelagic environment. So the pelagic environment can be divided up into different chunks, different regions. There's sort of that far from shore area that they call the oceanic part of the pelagic environment, the open ocean environment, which is generally a good distance off the coasts and also is over deep waters, deeper than 200 meters deep. Whereas the waters that are closer to the coasts, where the bottom is roughly 200 meters deep or less, those would be considered the neritic waters. So it's still the pelagic, but it's the neritic part of the pelagic. The neritic zone is different from the open ocean zone biologically and chemically, largely because it has more interactions with the terrestrial environment. There are terrigenous inputs of sediments, nutrients, pollutants, and other influences from the land. And also because the water is shallower in the neritic zone, there can be more interactions between waves stirring up the bottom and organisms moving between the surface and the bottom. So there's just a real difference that you can literally see in the color of the water, which tends to be more turbid with sediments and green with productive phytoplankton in the neritic zone, whereas the oceanic zone, the water is very clear, clean, and blue. It doesn't have a lot of debris or plankton in it, and the density of life in the oceanic part of the pelagic is lower as well. We can subdivide the parts of the ocean, the pelagic ocean, further than just neritic versus oceanic as well. And so this diagram from a textbook shows some of the zones that I want you to know. The epipelagic zone is the surface waters of the pelagic. Epi means surface. So that goes from literally the surface down to about 200 meters deep. And it's synonymous usually with the photic zone, which is the zone where there tends to be enough light for phytoplankton to do photosynthesis. So obviously the biology is very different in that sunlit zone where photosynthesis can happen than in the deeper zones where there's not enough light for photosynthesis. So just below the epipelagic zone, there's a zone from 200 to 1,000 meters deep that they call the mesopelagic zone. And that's also sometimes referred to as the twilight zone because there are some traces of light, at least in the upper parts of the mesopelagic zone. By the time you get to the bottom of the mesopelagic zone, though, um, there's no light. And then below the mesopelagic zone, you've got the bathypelagic zone where there's no light at all. Okay, so let's talk about the organisms that live in that zone of the pelagic. So we can classify them on their mobility or lack of mobility, and we can classify them in other ways that I'll talk about later. But let's start with this mobility-based classification. So organisms that swim weakly, if at all, and sort of drift at the mercy of the currents are called plankton. So Typically, the plankton are small, and one of the reasons that they can't make much progress swimming is because they're so small. But large organisms that are weak swimmers can also be considered to be plankton, like a big jellyfish that swims very weakly would be considered plankton, even though it's big enough to see without a microscope. A particular subgroup of plankton that lives right at the surface of the water is called neuston. I mean, usually neuston are planktonic organisms. Any organism that lives in association with the surface of the water would be considered neuston. Um, and so most of those organisms are planktonic organisms, like this Portuguese man of war, a colonial hydrozoan that drifts on the surface. And then the organisms that are large and fast enough to swim against the currents and go wherever they want to go are considered nekton. And those include organisms from a wide variety of branches of the tree of animal life. So that could be fishes, marine mammals, um, fast swimming invertebrates like squid. Those would all be considered nekton. Food webs in the pelagic environment involve both the plankton and the nekton that we talked about. We're generally starting with primary producers that are planktonic, tiny, single-celled plant-like organisms, and those are eaten by larger and larger organisms until you get up to the top predators of the ecosystem, things like sharks and marine mammals. So food webs in the pelagic environment are a little more simple than food webs in coastal environments where there are bottom-dwelling organisms that complicate things. And yet, pelagic food webs are still quite complex with a lot of many links in the chain. There are many trophic levels in pelagic food webs, and there's also complicated cross connections. Sometimes the juveniles of one organism might be prey at one stage in their life cycle and predators at other stages in their life cycle. So even though the pelagic is a relatively homogeneous, simple seeming environment, the interactions among organisms in the pelagic environment are quite complex and worthy of study. So one of the things that is an important interaction between pelagic organisms as well as between benthic organisms, of course, is competition. So competition is one of the three C's of community ecology, the others being cooperation and consumption. But competition is particularly important in sort of structuring the food webs of the pelagic environment. And it's given scientists a lot of challenge in understanding how the species of the pelagic environment can compete and yet coexist. So let's think more about competition in general, and then we'll apply it to the pelagic environment. So sort of backing up to the general ecological definition of competition, it's an interaction in which the fitness of each party involved is reduced by the presence of the other. So if you're involved in competition, even if you're the winner of that competition, your fitness is actually going to end up being less than what it would have been if there hadn't been someone else that you had to compete with. So fitness, again, is the ability to survive and reproduce, or how much you're able to contribute to the next generation in terms of your offspring and your genes that are passed on. So the example that I'm showing here to illustrate this competition is competition between two members of the same species. In this case, these are two elephant seals competing against each other for mates, most likely. So you can see that the fitness of both parties has been reduced. They're bloody from the bite marks on their necks as they're sort of bashing against each other with their teeth and bellowing and posturing. So you can see that competition can be a bloody business that even the winner may end up injured in competition. So competition's no joke. There's different types of competition that we can define. One important distinction is the distinction between intraspecific competition and interspecific competition. So intraspecific competition is with it's among organisms of the same species. So the example that I have there is two yellowfin tuna that are in competition with each other. Maybe they're in competition for prey or mates. So that's within the species. But you can also have competition between populations of different species, like the yellowfin tuna might be competing for the same prey resources as the bluefin tuna. The bluefin tuna are the ones on the right there. Competition can also be played out in different ways. So if you've got two organisms like the elephant seals on the beach that are literally fighting each other, they call that interference competition. So you can imagine maybe if you grew up in a big family sitting around the dinner table and something really good like the dessert or the rolls or something comes out to the dinner table and like you see it coming and you start fighting and stabbing your siblings with forks and stuff so that you'll be able to get that resource. That would be direct competition, like the stabbing each other with forks. But another way that you might compete over that resource, the food that you want, would be exploitation competition. So, maybe you don't stab your sibling with a fork, but you just eat the rolls really fast so that there's none left by the time they get to it. So, um, it's not like you're directly fighting the competitor, but you're using up the thing that the competitor needs and therefore depriving them of it. And that's how the competition is carried out. So that would be an indirect form of competition, but it's has the same effect of sort of reducing the fitness of the both competitors. All right, final form of competition, and my picture is kind of going to be blocking it. It's called apparent competition. So this is where there's two prey species that are both eaten by the same predator. And so if one of the prey species is doing well, it means that the predator population increases. And when the predator population increases, it means that it preys on the other prey species more. So if one of the prey species is doing well, it'll end up hurting the other because it'll indirectly because of increasing the predator. And so the end result is that one species doing well decreases the other species, but it's not through a direct interference or exploitation of resources or anything. It's because of increasing the predator, the mutual predator of both species. So there's these interesting theories that have come from studies of competition, and one of the most fundamental ones is the competitive exclusion principle, which is also known as Gauss's law because the scientist who first articulated this was named Georgy Gauss. So the idea is that when two species are competing for the same resources, so this is a case of resource competition, in the same environment, one of those species is not going to be able to make it in the end. Basically, whatever species is somewhat better at exploiting that resource is going to eventually starve the other one out, drive them to extinction. And this is related to the concept of the ecological niche because it basically says that no two species can occupy that same ecological niche. Whichever species is better at occupying that niche and using that resource is eventually going to drive any other species to extinct. And this theory isn't just based on thought, it's based on experiments that Gauss did using plankton. So that this is starting to relate it back to the pelagic environment. All right, so this X indicates that species number 2 in this case is being driven to extinction by competitive exclusion, as species 1 is better able to exploit the resource, therefore depriving species 2 of its livelihood. So the study system that Georgy Gauss based his theory of the competitive exclusion principle on was a simple planktonic system with two types of heterotrophic protists in there in the same genus, Paramecium caudatum and Paramecium aurelium. They are both single-celled eukaryotic organisms that go around in the plankton and they eat small particles of food like bacteria or detritus. And he was able to grow these paramecium in a chemostat, which is like a special little jar that has a steady input of food resources, and then the excess water overflows. So it's sort of like in a constant equilibrium, as there's an equal amount of water going in as going out, and a steady stream of resources going in, and then some of the waste, it goes out in the end. So um, a chemostat looks like something like this. You've got something to keep it homogeneous, like a little stir bar, like um, so it could be a magnetic stirrer, or it could be some other kind of mechanical stirrer that sort of keeps the water all swirled together. You don't want to have any sort of like layering in the water, or like some sort of bottom system that's separated from the mid part, because you want it to be a homogeneous system to be able to test this theory that in the same kind of environment, no two species can coexist. So you've got the side where there's inputs, and then a side where um, so medium is coming in, and then the excess vents out. And in this chemostat, you inoculate it with the two species of paramecium. So basically means you put a small number of each of these two species in there, and over time they'll begin to multiply, and their populations will reach the carrying capacity of the environment. So when you look at the results of that experiment over time, and the results are basically like the cell density or population numbers of the two species, you can see that initially there's an increase in the abundance of paramecium caudatum, but then the paramecium caudatum starts to decline. Meanwhile, the paramecium aurelia, they take a little longer to get going, but they eventually reach a high population and exclude the other paramecium. Gauss repeated this chemostat experiment many times, and he always found the same result. Um, Paramecium aurelia consistently dominated and made the other paramecium species go extinct in the chemostat. So paramecium caudatum would do okay at first, and then would be competitively excluded, eliminated by the paramecium aurelia, which was the dominant competitor in that environment. Um, what happened though, if Gauss changed the parameters a little bit, changed the rate of inflow of food, and other things that he could tweak with the mesocosms, with the chemostats, he would find that sometimes under a different set of conditions, paramecium caudatum would be the one that dominated, but it all depended on what the conditions were. Under a given set of conditions, one or the other species of paramecium always dominated, but which species dominated depended kind of on how he tweaked the settings on the chemostat. So one thing that Gauss never saw was like a stable coexistence where both species of paramecium were maintaining their populations. There was always one that was better suited to that set of conditions, and that species would competitively exclude the other species. And so it was from this series of many experiments that Gauss eventually came up with the competitive exclusion principle, the idea that no two species could coexist indefinitely in the same environment competing for the same resources. So the implication is that at least under a constant set of environmental parameters, competition for the same resource will lead to competitive exclusion of all but one of the species competing. So you can't have a stable coexistence of multiple species if they're in the same exact environment competing for the same exact thing. There'll always be one that's better, and that one excludes the others. The thing is that nature is not a constant, unchanging environment. Nature presents a range of environmental parameters. We've talked about that previously, how there's abiotic gradients, ranges of conditions of temperature, salinity, light levels, habitat characteristics like substrate, and a range of resources to compete for. So um, there are different opportunities for organisms to specialize in being the competitively dominant species in their particular niche of the environment. So natural selection, this evolutionary process, sort of sculpts species so that they can dominate under their particular set of conditions. And under that set of conditions, they won't have to deal with competitors, even though in other conditions they might be excluded by species that are adapted to those other conditions. And this sort of specialization where the sort of overall range of conditions in the environment is being kind of partitioned among species is called niche differentiation. And that relates back to the example that we gave in a previous talk about how uh, organisms' niches in the environment are sort of narrowed by competition. We talked about how the fundamental range of conditions that a fir tree or a pine tree could occupy is fairly broad and there's overlap, but due to competition, that sort of compresses the species down into uh, the area or range of environmental conditions where it does best and can be the competitively dominant species. So you can see that sort of this range of overlap here is minimized by the specialization and competitive dominance of these species within the range of conditions that they do best in. So how does that work in the pelagic environment? In the pelagic environment, it looks like a big blue sameness. It's hard to see where the environmental variation might be in this environment that's allowing species to specialize. And it looks homogeneous. Homogeneous means like well mixed, all the same. It's not actually homogeneous, but it certainly looks that way. And so that leads us to the paradox of the plankton. So um, thinking about Gauss's law, scientists who were studying the ocean were sort of scratching their heads and wondering like, well, if in a chemostat you can't even get two species to coexist without one driving the other to extinction, how can you have hundreds or thousands of species in the same seawater that are coexisting, many of them competing for the same resources, light and nutrients? So the paradox of the plankton was a term that was coined in the 1960s by G. Evelyn Hutchinson, an oceanographer, um, to sort of, uh, and the paradox, of course, is how can you have so many different species coexisting in an environment that doesn't seem to offer opportunities for specialization? Um, I mean, the plankton, at least the phytoplankton, are all sort of in the same water. They're competing for the same light and nutrients, and so what gives? Well, this is a place where I often pause the lecture and ask students to try to resolve the paradox of the plankton. How is it that we can have so many species of plankton coexisting in the same environment without one taking over and driving the others to extinction? So if you want to pause here and try to see if you can think of some of the things I might be about to say, see if you can do that. Otherwise, I'll move on and uh, go through some of the things that scientists have come up with to try to explain the paradox of the plankton. So there are actually a lot of hypotheses to explain how we can have such diversity in a seemingly homogeneous environment. And it's probably, the reality is probably that each of these things plays some role in determining how we can have so many species coexisting in a seemingly homogeneous environment. One is that the environment is not actually that homogeneous, that there are some ways that the pelagic environment can be partitioned, and there might be vertical partitions in relation to gradients in light, nutrients, turbulence, temperature, other things that might sort of vary throughout the water column and that might lead to some species doing better at the lower part of the euphotic zone, other species better and right at the surface waters, for example. Um, Another thing is that not every relationship between two different species in the environment is a competition. Some might be non-competitive relationships, mutualisms, or organisms that are don't interfere with each other in any negative way. That would be commensalism, where they're not hurting or helping each other, or one's benefiting and the other doesn't mind. Then it's possible that there's predatory effects that actually facilitate coexistence. And that would be similar to the example we talked about in the intertidal zone, where a predator is able to suppress a species that would otherwise dominate the others. And so maybe there is some phytoplankton species that would dominate the environment, but that phytoplankton species tends to be vulnerable to the predators, and the predators keep it from ever really taking over, which allows other phytoplankton species to coexist in that environment. So that sort of top-down control by the predators might allow more opportunities for the prey species to coexist. And then maybe one of the most powerful explanations for resolving the paradox of the plankton is the idea that the ocean environment is changing through time too rapidly for any one species to ever take over. So basically, at any one moment in time, there might be one particular species that would be the best species for that moment, and it would be increasing, increasing. But before it ever really takes completely over, the conditions in the environment change due to the seasons changing or a different swirl of current coming through. And now all of a sudden that species no longer has its advantage, and some other species might start increasing. And so it's sort of a dynamic equilibrium. Instead of having like a steady set of species, you have sort of this shifting ups and downs. One species is doing well, then it's not doing so well, but another species is doing well, and it sort of varies who's in the lead at any one time, and this sort of prevents any one species from dominating or any one species from being driven totally extinct. And visualizing that heterogeneity or variability through time and space in the pelagic environment is a lot easier now than it was in the 1960s, because we have access to all of this kind of satellite imagery, which can show us, as it does in this picture, variation in sea surface temperature in different parts of the pelagic environment. And so you can, in this picture of the east coast of the United States, you can see the Gulf Stream current kind of peeling off of the coastline around North Carolina here and veering out into the Atlantic. And swirling off the Gulf Stream current are these eddies of warm water that show up as orange colors against a blue background. Meanwhile, there's the Labrador current, cold water current moving from north to south along the coast. And in the shallow coastal waters, you see sort of local warming where the water's shallow and moving slowly, and it can heat up more quickly. So there's a lot of variability in the temperature conditions of the ocean, and in association with these different current patterns, there's also variation in nutrient levels and other conditions that sort of affect what types of pelagic life are going to be doing best in these different places. And there can be certain places, a lot of times at the boundaries of two really different types of water mass, that can be hot spots for life, where there's a very good set of conditions that allows a lot of primary productivity of phytoplankton, and then a food chain based on that phytoplankton productivity can flourish in those areas. There's also an effect where the current patterns, all these complex swirls of currents in the oceans, they'll sometimes bring materials together. So where currents converge, you get these sort of lines of floating debris, like floating algae. The sargassum is a type of brown seaweed that floats on the surface of the ocean and accumulates in the open ocean. You can sort of get these gatherings of what is potentially food and habitat for other organisms, and animal life will congregate in these areas where the plants and detritus are accumulating as well. Mobile organisms don't just clump together passively as a result of currents, but they will intentionally sort of school together for protection, or sometimes predators will drive their prey into tighter congregations that they call bait balls, which then makes it actually easier for them to feed on. So these predatory sailfish here have sort of corralled these bait fish into a ball where they can prey on them more easily. So there's a lot of mechanisms, both driven by currents, which sort of passively swirl food together into clumps, and then driven by the behaviors of the mobile organisms, which further sort of lead to clumps and congregations, with the result being that life in the pelagic environment, instead of being sort of like evenly spread everywhere, it's very much clumped up. So there's bare patches, and then there's also patches of really dense life. So the fact that plankton and other organisms in the pelagic are not just evenly distributed, but they're clumped into like a few places of really dense life and then barren places, it's actually really important for the survival of some of the most wonderful organisms in the ocean, the baleen whales, which are very, very large filter feeders. It's important for them that they can find these clumps of dense plankton, because if the plankton were just evenly spread, then the whales wouldn't be able to get enough, no matter how long they swam, to meet their energetic needs, and they would eventually starve. So it's the fact that they're able to zero in on unusually dense concentrations of planktonic prey that allow these great whales to meet their energetic needs and basically take in more calories than they expend in swimming. So thank goodness for the clumpiness of plankton. It's what allows us to have whales. On the topic of whales, there are lots of wonderful species of whales in the world. So we were just looking at the right whale, one type of baleen whale that's a filter feeder with these big filter comb-like plates in its mouth. There are other wonderful filter feeders that feed in slightly different ways. The second biggest whale in the world is the fin whale, Balænoptera physalis, and here you can see them filter feeding. In contrast with the right whale, which filter feeds by just sort of swimming along with its mouth open and catching everything, the fin whales, they feed by gulping a huge thing of water and squeezing it out through their baleen. So you can see that gulping action happening here as the whale's gulping glob of water to filter the plankton out. So it's not just these giant marine mammals, the baleen whales, that are large filter feeders. Basking sharks are very large sharks, bigger than great white sharks, but they don't eat people. They eat microscopic plankton, and they don't have baleen to filter it out, but they have specially adapted gill rakers, which are able to filter out the plankton that are then passed to the gut of the basking sharks, and they trundle along through the waters of the ocean with their mouths gaping open, filtering out plankton. Another shark that's a filter feeder is the whale shark, the largest fish in the world. And whale sharks have a similar type of gills that helps them filter out the plankton from the water. These fish swimming around the shark are remoras. All right, so in this vast pelagic environment where we know food is patchily distributed, how would an organism go about finding food? Let's say that organism finds itself in a patch of barren water where there's no food. Let's say that organism is a great white shark, so it needs large fish or marine mammals to prey on. Where would it go? I mean, it's got 360 degrees that it could choose from, could go anywhere. How would you decide where to go if you were a shark? Well, we have some insight into the sort of feeding search patterns of sharks from tagging programs. So there's a link in the lower part of the slide here, which you can look at later, which will allow you to project shark tracking data on a map of the Earth, and you can see sort of the patterns of where they go. And you tend to see a pattern like this, where the shark or whatever large predator is that's tagged will have long journeys sort of in a straight line. And then if it encounters food, it will have this sort of meandering path through that area where it encountered food until it's no longer encountering food in that area. And then it'll just sort of pick a direction, seemingly at random, but maybe there might be something more to it. And it'll swim for a long period of time again until it encounters food again. And as long as it's finding food in that area with reasonable frequency, it'll stay in that area. Um, and then eventually, when that area is no longer productive, it'll buzz out again and take another one of these long journeys until it hits another patch. So that's sort of the effective strategy that seems to have evolved and is now used by many different types of roving predators of the marine pelagic environment. So speaking of the marine pelagic environment, I want to share a personal story about something that I did when I was a young scientist, still an undergraduate student, and I was looking for summer experiences that would give me some marine biology credentials to add to my biology degree that I was pursuing at the time. So I found an internship at the National Marine Fisheries Service lab in in Newport, Oregon, which is on the central Oregon coast. And the project was actually based a little further north of the lab, and it studied part of the ocean called the Columbia River plume, which is where the Columbia River, one of the largest rivers in the West, it comes out um, into the Pacific Ocean, bringing with it a lot of nutrients that can fuel phytoplankton blooms. And the river is also a migratory corridor for salmon, which are born in mountain streams as tiny little babies, and then the salmon eventually develop as adults in the open ocean and feed wandering throughout the Pacific Ocean before eventually coming back into the ocean to back into the river to reproduce. So this area around the mouth of the river is like a real nexus for a lot of biological activity because you've got lots of uh, plankton and a whole food chain based on that productive plankton where the river's coming out. And you also have these migratory species that are passing through in their long journeys. So we were sort of studying what happened to the baby salmon when they exited the streams and entered this dangerous ocean environment, and what might be happening to them in the food chain. Because, some years a lot of the baby salmon survive and many come back a few years later to spawn. Other years, for whatever reason, not very many of the baby salmon survive. And that might be because the baby salmon didn't have enough food to eat, or maybe the baby salmon were getting eaten by their predators. And it was just kind of like a mystery what was happening to those baby salmon when they entered the ocean, and did why were some years really good for the returning salmon and other years not so much. So we were doing these 3-day cruises where we would tow a net near shore and then at various places further offshore to see sort of what was going on in the food chain at these different places off the mouth of the Columbia River. The boat that we used for this was a commercial fishing boat that most of the year it was just used by private fishermen catching fish for money, but we would charter it. Two scientists and the college intern, which was me at the time, uh, and we would put a different kind of net on it that we could use to survey the life in the pelagic waters of the ocean at night, because at nighttime was when a lot of the predators would come up to the surface waters to feed. So that's when we could get the best sense of what was going on in the ocean food chain. The thing is, this was a real rough part of the ocean. The Pacific Ocean is rough, and this area around the mouth of the Columbia River was especially rough. And boy, I really got seasick on that trip. The first 24 hours, I think I must have thrown up every 15 minutes. Eventually, I sort of got it under control with medication, but it was a real rough experience, and it actually kind of changed uh, what I decided to focus on. I now work in more coastal waters where I don't have to worry about getting seasick so much. I'm sort of in shallow waters with small waves. You'd have to pay me an extra bonus to get out on the Sea Eagle again. That was rough. I also remember that just that smell of the diesel fumes of the engine, and also all the rotting fish that were sort of like stuck in the floorboards of the boat. They had cats on board too that would pee on your pillow, and just like all of the smells together plus the rocking of the boat was just made for a really seasick environment. And I have a lot of respect for the commercial fishermen that work in this rough environment all the time. It's not only unpleasant, but it's quite dangerous. Anyways, that I encourage you all, if you're undergraduate students, to um, try some of these challenging experiences. You might love it, or it might cause you to question the route in your career. But overall, definitely like look for these kind of summer research opportunities because they can um, really be cool. Um, so this organism here, is one of the species of Pacific salmon. It's a coho salmon in the genus Oncorhynchus. And this is a juvenile, of course. They get to be huge as adults. But these juvenile salmon are the ones that we were sort of doing all of this study to find out what happened to them. But finding out what happens to a salmon in the big Pacific Ocean is pretty tricky because there are many other fish in the ocean which are more common than the baby salmon. For example, there's tons of bait fish of many species, like this giant pile that I am making snow angels in is a pile of Pacific sardines. And there are other bait fish like herring and smelt that we would also hit these patches of sometimes. So we weren't trying to catch a lot of fish. We weren't trying to load up the boat with fish to sell or anything. We just wanted to get a sample of what was out there. But because, as I mentioned earlier, life in the ocean is very patchy. Sometimes we would get a just one bucket full of fish from the whole 20-minute long net tow, and other times we would hit a patch of dense life, and the entire deck of the boat would be flooded with massive amounts of fish like this that we would have to sort through, sorting through buckets of fish, counting them, measuring them, taking blood samples. We would, with the larger fish that we caught, like things that were potentially predators of the salmon, such as the Pacific hake here, we would take a few of those and kill them and preserve their stomachs. And we would look through their stomach contents to see what they were eating and if they had any baby salmon in their stomachs. So, you know, I'm actually not sure what the ultimate results were of the study because I was more involved on the data collection end and wasn't quite didn't have the skills yet to do the analysis of the overall results of the study. But I hope that they got some more insight into the fate of the salmon in the Pacific Ocean and what causes them more to come back some years than others. One really interesting thing about this trip was that we would pull the net near shore and then it successively further points offshore up to about 30 nautical miles offshore. And there was a very distinct change in both the amount of life and the types of life, depending on whether we were towing sort of like within 2 nautical miles of shore or 30 nautical miles of shore. And when we were far offshore, we caught a lot less life because there's just less productivity due to less nutrients, less phytoplankton, less zooplankton, and the whole food chain is reduced as you're further offshore in an environment that doesn't have as much nutrients fueling it. And yet some of the life that we would see out there was really interesting and adapted to that more open ocean environment. For example, near shore we saw a lot of gulls, but offshore we would see other seabirds that we didn't see near shore, including the black-footed albatross. And we knew we were getting far offshore when we started to see the albatross flying around the boat. So this wasn't just seasickness and misery, it was also a really interesting natural history experience. Uh, okay, moving on from my personal story and back to the meat of the lecture, there's a very special part of the pelagic ocean called the neustic zone, and it refers to the very surface layer. So what's floating on the surface or just beneath the surface is sort of this subset of the pelagic zone called the neustic zone. And there are a variety of organisms that are specially adapted to living right at the surface of the water. Sargassum, which is a type of brown algae, brown seaweed, that has little air bladders in it that allow it to float at the surface, is specially adapted to living in the neustic zone. It's a very obvious neustic species because it floats right at the surface. And they're in this pelagic habitat, which otherwise has no sort of solid structure for organisms to hide in. The sargassum provides a really great habitat, and there's actually a whole set of species that are adapted specifically to living in the sargassum mats, and they have camouflage that's specific to the color of sargassum and adaptations to sort of avoid predators and find prey living in the sargassum environment. Another cool organism that floats at the surface is the Portuguese man-o'-war. They call it a jellyfish, but it's actually a colonial hydrozoan, only distantly related to jellyfish and made up of several different clones that are sort of play different roles in the overall body structure, some forming the float, others forming the tentacles and mouths and things like that. So this organism kind of drifts and sails across the ocean with its long feeding tentacles trailing below it. And as it trails through the ocean, it's sort of like a fishing net being towed behind it, and it can catch small fishes and zooplankton in its tentacles to eat. Relative of the Portuguese man o' war is another colonial hydrozoan, Porpita porpita. It's called the blue button jellyfish commonly, even though it's not really a true jellyfish. This organism has stinging cells that help defend it and catch it prey, but some predators like the Glaucus atlanticus, a particular type of pelagic sea slug, are adapted to be immune to the stinging cells of these hydrozoans, and it can nip off pieces of their tentacles. It will even feed off bits of the Portuguese man o' war, which is has a very strong sting, very painful to humans. And yet, the Glaucus atlanticus, not only is this sea slug not affected by the sting, it can pass the stinging cells of the jellyfish through its body and into its own body appendages without setting them off. And then if some potential predator touches the sea slug can actually defend itself with the stinging cells that it stole from the hydrozoans that it feeds on. And they call this kleptoplasty, sort of stealing part of the body or defense features of your prey and using them as your own. Another colonial hydrozoan, distant relative of jellyfish that floats in the neustic zone, is Velella velella. It has a little membranous sail which allows it to drift at sort of a 45-degree angle to the wind direction. And this sort of helps it scoot across the pelagic environment. And if it ever flips over in a wave, the top half is hydrophobic, so it tends to flip back right side up. And these things flourish in the ocean. The only thing is that sometimes if the wind blows the wrong direction, they can end up washing up on shore in huge amounts. So sometimes you'll see them not being beautiful and graceful floating on the surface, but dead and rotting on the beach. And the video here shows is a really interesting presentation on the sort of evolution and lifestyle and reproductive system of the Velella velella, sort of explaining how this very complicated organism arose from ancestors that probably lived on the bottom. One of the weirdest of the organisms that lives near the surface waters of the ocean is this cephalopod. It's a type of octopus, actually, called the argonaut. So it has this spiraling shell, which is actually an egg case. It's not a true shell. So it looks a lot like a chambered nautilus, another cephalopod that has tentacles and lives in a spiral shell, but it's not closely related. It's much more closely related to octopuses than the chambered nautiluses, even though they're both cephalopods. There's a lot of sexual dimorphism in this species, so the female looks totally different from the male. The male doesn't make a shell because, as I said, the shell is an egg case. The male is tiny and he'll hitchhike, like he'll ride along in the shell of the female. And these organisms have an ability to control the amount of air in their shells. So they'll go up to the surface and trap some air in their shell, and then they'll go to a level in the water where they're neutrally buoyant, so they can sort of swim along at a mid-depth without having to waste any energy fighting against their buoyancy issues. So they're really masters of living in conjunction with that air-water interface. They feed on a variety of slow-moving prey. One of the things that they'll eat is jellyfish. And in this cool picture here, one is sort of riding along on the jellyfish as it munches away at the bell of the jellyfish, which is pretty neat. And the video here about the argonaut explains some of the weird mysteries of the argonaut and how we sort of learned more about their lifestyle and behaviors in the neustic zone through research. So I recommend the video. Not all organisms that live at the air-water interface are sort of slow drifting kind of organisms. There are some actively swimming nekton that live at the surface, and flying fish are an example of them. They're obviously adapted to living in and just out of the water. They have these pectoral and ventral fins which are enlarged and allow them to briefly soar on the air. Also, their caudal fin has a lower lobe which is longer than the upper lobe, and that allows them to sort of get a little extra flick as as just the lower part of their tail is in the water to propel them on their leaps. And of course, they leap through the air to escape predators. So there is a lot of predation in the marine environment, and predators coming up from below could sort of pin something against the surface. But if you're able to escape the surface and jump away and soar away, then there's a chance that the predator won't be able to see where you land and you'll escape. So that's how the flying fish do. There's actually a lot of different species and even multiple genera of flying fish, but they're all in this family Exocetidae. Okay, so the flying fish, the Portuguese man o' war, the blue button jellyfish, the Glaucus atlanticus sea slug, all these organisms that we've looked at are blue. So why is that? This is a place where I usually pause the slide and ask the class for a couple of different hypotheses. So if you want to try to think of some yourself, you can do that here, or I'll just reveal the answers. So one of the reasons is camouflage. So um, the pelagic environment is blue, so if you're blue against a blue background, you'll be harder to see. One of the subtleties of the camouflage is called counter shading. So that is where an organism will be sort of like darker on the top than on the bottom half. And that means that if you're looking at it from the top, um, you see it against a dark background and it doesn't blend in. I mean, it does blend in, and if you're looking at it from the bottom, you see, the background of the sky will be sort of pale, and so you see this kind of like pale part of the belly of the thing against the pale sky, and so it kind of masks the silhouette of the organism. So that protects it from if you're looking at it from the top, and if you're looking at it from the side, um, the sun rays sort of brighten the back of the organism, but the shadow darkens the belly of the organism, and that sort of cancels out, so you don't see the organism at all. And so that's how counter shading works. And it's called counter shading. So that's why so many organisms are darker on the back and lighter on the belly. So counter shading is just a special type of camouflage. Um, Another reason to be blue is for UV protection. So the strongest and most damaging rays of the sun in the bright surface waters of the Neustic zone are the um, uh, I'm trying to remember if they're longer waves, or I think they're the shorter wavelengths of light, the blue and violet, and even the ultraviolet, which are the really short wavelengths of light. And so those are the most damaging wavelengths of light. And if you are able to reflect those damaging wavelengths of light, then they're less likely to damage your DNA. So this is supposed to be DNA inside the organism. So if you've got blue pigments in your skin that reflect these damaging wavelengths of blue and ultraviolet light, then you're protecting the DNA inside your cells, and also you look blue because you're reflecting the blue and light, and you're also reflecting the ultraviolet light, which is a wavelength that's kind of close to blue. So it's for UV protection and for camouflage. Those are both reasons to be blue in the pelagic environment. Okay, I've been talking about plankton a little bit, but I have kind of skipped the general introduction to plankton. So I want to talk about some basic theory of plankton, and I'll incorporate that here in the Pelagic ecosystems lecture. So plankton, they're organisms that drift or swim so weakly that they cannot counteract currents. There's a nice little video introduction to the plankton here at this link if you want to go to that. So the definition of plankton is based on the inability to swim rapidly. And it means that, most plankton are small organisms that don't swim well, but some of them are big. And this video here it's cheesy, it has bad music, but it shows really cool giant plankton. So this colonial gelatinous sea squirt that is enormous and very cool on the video there. This Leatherback sea turtle is the biggest type of sea turtle in the world, and it eats gelatinous zooplankton. So it eats jellyfish, but it also eats other gelatinous organisms like this giant pyrosome, which is a colony of sea squirts. So they're actually primitive uh, chordates that filter feed. They pump water in one end and out the other end, and they form these things that look like giant socks. And they're a delicious snack for a leatherback sea turtle. The black and white striped fish there are pilot fish, which is a type of jack that has evolved to sort of accompany large nekton through the ocean, and they sort of look for scraps of food that the manta rays or sea turtles or whales or whatever they're following might miss or drop in their sloppy feeding. There's different ways to classify plankton, lots of different ways, and we're going to talk about various plankton classifications, some based on size and some based on other things. But one of the most important ways to classify plankton is based on how they get their food and energy. So the two major divisions are phytoplankton and zooplankton. Phytoplankton are autotrophs. They're plants, basically. They do photosynthesis. They don't eat. They sort of make their organic matter by using the power of the sun to synthesize organic matter from simple inorganic ingredients like carbon dioxide, water, and inorganic nutrients. And then there's zooplankton. So zooplankton are tiny heterotrophic organisms, some of them animals, some of them large protists, and they eat existing organic matter to survive. So they'll consume smaller cells or detritus to survive. Then there are these other groups of plankton that we don't use these terms as much, but they're also important to know. Bacterioplankton are small prokaryotes, both bacteria and archaea, which is actually separate domain of life than bacteria, but they're similar in that they're very tiny cells, and they're generally decomposers. So they don't eat in the traditional sense, but they sort of colonize the surface of detrital particles and break them down, or they'll absorb dissolved organic matter from the water around them as their way of getting food. Mycoplankton, so there are fungi like single-celled yeasts and things that are part of the plankton community, and they're generally decomposers. And then there's this weird classification of plankton, mixotrophs, and so they can be photosynthetic or not. And so they might get some of their energy from photosynthesis, but then they might also eat things too. So some dinoflagellate are mixotrophs. They can do photosynthesis, but then they can also eat other cells, which really complicates your studies of the food chain if an organism is both a plant and a consumer. But one of the things that makes biology interesting is the complication. And so mixotrophs, they are a thing in plankton communities. Another way that we can classify plankton is based on their lifestyle. So not just what they eat, but kind of how they live and what they are when they're born versus what they are when they're adults. And the two big classifications here are holoplankton, which live their whole life as plankton, and that's sort of how I remember the word holoplankton. They're plankton for their whole life. So the babies are plankton and the grown-ups are still plankton. Diatoms are an example of a type of phytoplankton that's holoplankton, but something that like a kelp might have a planktonic larvae, even though as an adult it's a multicellular seaweed that lives on a benthic lifestyle and it's not planktonic. So that shows that, so something that would be planktonic as a larvae, but then not planktonic as an adult would be meroplankton. So the kelp would be an example of a photosynthetic meroplankton, which is a planktonic algal cell as a juvenile, but a benthic seaweed as an adult. So that would make it meroplankton. But the examples that I have on the slide here are merozooplankton, animal plankton that they have planktonic larvae that are non-planktonic adults. So polychaete is a type of worm that usually they live a benthic lifestyle as adults, so they'll live down in the mud when they're adults, but as plankton, they're larvae drifting around. Brittle stars are, sea stars as with spindly arms as adults. but they're even weirder looking microscopic larvae as juveniles. Behind my picture here is a blue crab larvae, which is a weird little swimmy shrimp thing as a larvae, but becomes a crab that's benthic and can actually still swim as adults. Blue crabs can swim. Not all crabs can swim as adults, but blue crabs can swim both as larvae and as adults. So maybe it's a weird example. I guess you could consider a blue crab to be nekton as an adult, but plankton as a juvenile, and snail larvae, which very strange looking, and become snails, which are usually benthic as adults. Even some really large vertebrates are plankton as juveniles. So tuna, some of the largest bony fish in the oceans, have tiny, tiny eggs that hatch into tiny larvae, which can barely swim, and they just drift as part of the plankton, eating other, even smaller plankton. And then they gradually get bigger and develop more ability to uh, swim against the currents until they sort of cross that line, and it's kind of a blurry line, but eventually they'll cross over um, until they can be considered nekton, basically actively swimming organisms, and then the mother and father tuna meet and start the next generation here. You can see they're spawning, which generates the fertilized eggs, which completes the cycle. Okay, so we talked about plankton classification by trophic mode, by what they eat or how they get their food. We talked about the sort of their life history, which is sort of like whether both the adults and babies are planktonic or whether the adults are something that's not planktonic. And now we're talking about size. Okay, so you can break plankton up into different categories based on how big they are. And the very smallest types of plankton, they call it femtoplankton, and that's smaller than any living cell. So it's so small that only viruses, which are smaller than a cell, can be considered femtoplankton. And yes, actually, there are viruses in the marine environment. And it's interesting, viruses can sort of last a long time and be transported a long distance in marine waters, whereas viruses in the terrestrial environment might have more problems with drying out in the air and things like that. And so marine viruses have an interesting role in the cycles of life in the ocean. One of the things that the viruses do in the ocean is that they'll infect cells of larger plankton, and then they'll cause those cells to eventually burst and spill all the organic matter that was in them out into the environment along with a bunch of viruses. And so um, the marine viruses sort of contribute to the dissolved organic matter in the ocean because they're basically busting cells open by infecting and splitting them open. So an important role that we're still working to understand with the marine viruses. The smallest actual cells, that have genetic material surrounded by a cell membrane and do all the homeostasis things that living cells do to be truly alive, are considered picoplankton. So they're prokaryotes generally, although some of the very smallest eukaryotic cells are in that same size range of 0.2 to 2 micrometers in diameter. So Prochlorococcus is a type of marine cyanobacteria that's very small and lives in low light areas of the marine pelagic environment. And then the next size step up would be nanoplankton, 2 to 20 micrometers in diameter. And so that's mostly small eukaryotic cells. And including this three-letter abbreviation here, HNF, which stands for heterotrophic nanoflagellates, an ecologically important group of small eukaryotic cells that are major consumers of the picoplankton. So they're at just the right size to be the consumers of the sort of marine bacteria. And so they're an important link in the food chain. Larger organisms, and again, I'm sorry that my little picture is in front of them. Microplankton are large unicellular organisms, and this size range also includes some very small multicellular organisms, but they would generally eat single-celled prey like the small eukaryotic cells. I think the organism that I'm showing here is a radiolarian. So a radiolarian is a heterotrophic protist that lives inside a silica dioxide shell. So the radiolarian is kind of like an amoeba, which is this predatory blob cell thing, but it lives inside weird crystal shell, and it sort of extends pseudopods out from that crystal shell to engulf its prey and then bring them back in and digest them. So there's some really exotic structures of the organisms of the microplankton, and they're really cool to look at under a microscope. Moving up the chain, we're getting into the small multicellular organisms now. So that's the mesozooplankton, mesoplankton, which is largely zooplankton. Animals like copepods, a type of small one-eyed crustacean, is the one eye, and krill, another type of small crustacean, looks a little more like a shrimp. And these things, at the larger range of mesozooplankton, 20 millimeters, that's like enough that you would actually be able to see that with your naked eye if you were up close. And then plankton get bigger as well. Macroplankton, 2 to 20 centimeters, that's up to about this big. And that includes organisms like this salp here. A salp is another word for pelagic sea squirt. So you may have seen sea squirts as these sort of leathery organisms that live stuck to the bottom in sort of these clumps that look like meatballs. But there are also sort of gelatinous salps that live in the pelagic environment, and some of them are colonial, and those giant pyrosomes, like the thing that the leatherback sea turtle was eating, was a colony of organisms that are kind of related to this. And there's a variety of jellyfish. Jellyfish are not actually fish. They're, of course, in a totally different phylum of life, but many of the jellies are in this size class of macroplankton. And then there's megaplankton, greater than 20 centimeters. So they're very large organisms, like the biggest jellyfish. There's a big jellyfish in this picture that my face is blocking here, the giant pyrosomes, so the colonies of sea squirts. And there's even some really big fish that we would consider to be megaplankton, because these fish swim so poorly that they sort of drift at the mercy of the currents. And this mola mola, the giant ocean sunfish in the picture here, would be an example of something that is often classified as megaplankton. And their prey is also plankton. They like to eat gelatinous zooplankton, so they would eat jellyfish and salps and other maybe macroplankton. Let's talk about the differences in plankton communities that you see when you're near the coast versus further off the coast. So there's a lot more plankton generally near the coast than further offshore. And this axis here is on a log scale. So what this indicates is that there's more than 10 times the amount of plankton near the coast that there is offshore. And there's a big shift in what types of plankton dominate the community near shore versus offshore. So near shore, diatoms are one of the dominant plankton species because they do really well in nutrient-rich environments, whereas further offshore, coccolithophores and dinoflagellates, which are more adapted to low nutrient conditions, play more of a role. And this is a very simplified diagram, but there would also be many other groups of plankton that you might find in varying amounts in all these environments. But cyanobacteria would be another type of plankton that you might find, both near shore and offshore, but different types of cyanobacteria would live in these different environments. So there's some interesting trends in the species composition of plankton from near shore to offshore. So it's not just that the total amount of plankton is changing, but the types of plankton change. And one of the types of plankton change that I'd like you to know is that there's more diatoms generally in the nutrient-rich waters near shore, and more other types of plankton in the less nutrient-rich waters further from shore. One of the consequences of the fact that there's different types of plankton in the nearshore pelagic environment versus the open ocean pelagic environment is that the food chains based on those phytoplankton have a different structure. So in the neritic environment, which again is the nutrient-rich waters near shores dominated by large-celled phytoplankton like diatoms, since those cells are large and easy to eat for relatively large zooplankton, you sort of have short food chain where it's sort of one step from these large primary producers to also large um, herbivores like the krill, which go along and eat diatoms, and krill are fairly large, up to a centimeter or a couple centimeters long for the larger species of krill. Krill is the colloquial term for these crustaceans. Euphausids is the more scientific name for what we commonly refer to as krill. In an oceanic environment where there's less nutrients and larger cells of phytoplankton have a hard time growing, you tend to have the primary producers being these very small-celled phytoplankton like cyanobacteria, which are eaten by heterotrophic nanoflagellates like this one here, and then those tiny eukaryotic cells are eaten by larger eukaryotic cells like this radiolarian, and you're already 3 levels into the food chain, and you're still just at pretty small single-celled organisms here. And then the final organism, I'm not eating this radiolarian even though my picture is here, but this could be like a copepod or some other multicellular zooplankton by the time we get to the fourth level in the pelagic food chain. So oceanic food chain, since you're starting out really small and it takes more steps in the food chain to get up to the multicellular zooplankton, whereas it's just basically one step to get to the multicellular zooplankton. In the nutrient-rich coastal waters, it's like 3 steps to get to the that level if you're in the open ocean. There's these interesting patterns of biogeography in planktonic organisms where, and these kind of contrast with the biogeographic patterns that we see for organisms that are more associated with the seabed. So for sea bottom life, there's often species that have like really localized ranges. They might be found just on one particular stretch of coastline or on one particular island. Whereas with the pelagic organisms of the open ocean, their habitat is huge and very interconnected, so they tend to have these really broad geographic ranges. Like these 2 species of krill sort of are found all the way around the world in the Southern Ocean. And then this Euphausia brevis is a species that's found in every ocean of the world in the sort of warm temperate waters. Um, and then there's this Euphausia diomede found in the Indo-Pacific Ocean in the tropical waters, although you do start to see some of the effects of there being biogeographic barriers, like Euphausia diomede is not found in the Atlantic Ocean. Because of this sort of geographic barrier here. And then some of the, or one of the species of krill that is found in the North Pacific Ocean is not found in the Southern Hemisphere or the North Atlantic Ocean because of sort of the significant biogeographic barriers there. So there are some biogeographic barriers like the hot waters of the tropics that would prevent Southern Hemisphere plankton species from being found in cold waters of the Northern Hemisphere and vice versa, and the continental barriers that might prevent some Pacific species from being found in the Atlantic and vice versa. But overall, there tends to be a lot of really large ranges and interconnectivity of plankton's ranges because they're drifting in the currents and they're living in the open ocean. So it's not like they have to be localized to a particular patch of shoreline or island like a benthic species might be. One of the interesting things that plankton, at least the larger plankton, do is they migrate up and down in the water column on a daily cycle. So something that happens on a 24-hour cycle is called a diel or daily. So plankton, the ocean is really big, and plankton are not going to like swim across the ocean. That's just too far for them. But there are rapid changes in the ocean as you move from the surface to deeper down. In fact, if you've ever been swimming in a lake, maybe in the springtime, you could feel warm water near the surface and colder water deeper down, or you could notice bright waters near the surface, and you dive down with your goggles or mask on, you see darker waters deeper down. So in a relatively small vertical distance, you can get big environmental changes. And so plankton, even though they can't swim really long distances, they can swim a bit up and down and get themselves into like a significantly different environment with just a little bit of up and down swimming. So even though it's kind of futile for them to try to go long distances, east, west, north, and south, if they move in that z-axis, the up and down axis, they can really change their environment. And they do that intentionally to sort of be in the optimal environment for different times of day. Some of them will even swim a couple hundred meters to move between the epipelagic and mesopelagic environments. So epipelagic meaning from 0 to 200 meters, and then the mesopelagic being the environment from 200 meters down to 1,000 meters. So what we often see is these migrating plankton. During the daytime, they'll hang out in the dark beneath the euphotic zone, and then at the nighttime they'll move up into the surface waters. And you can start to think about, well, why would they do that? Why would they go to the trouble of doing that? Also, how do we know they do that? It was discovered by scientists sort of by accident. Scientists working for the military actually developed this sort of sound-based system of detecting objects underwater based on echoes of sound coming back from the sound producing device to the sound sensing device. They call this sonar. And this was initially used to detect submarines and things underwater that might be attacking your boat. But when people were looking at the sonar readouts over time and making logs of the sonar readouts over time, they started to notice this weird thing where at nighttime, like in the hours between midnight and 6 a.m., and the hours between 6 p.m. and the next midnight, you would see this layer of uh, particles in the water near the surface. And then during the daytime, that layer of particles that sound was bouncing off of seemed to move down deeper. And so people got really curious about, like, what is it in the water that the sound is bouncing off of that seems to be near the surface at night but deep down during the day, up to sort of like 100 to 200 meters deep in the day. And so scientists towed nets through the surface waters at night and deeper waters during the day, and sort of did it in a controlled manner to see what was where at different times. And they found that there was this group of large zooplankton and small nekton, like these fishes called myctophids, and there's some shrimps and stuff in here. And these small organisms were migrating up and down in what they call the deep scattering layer. And the deep scattering layer was based on that it was scattering sound waves from the sonar. That's why they call it the deep scattering layer. But it's basically made up of these small vertically migrating large plankton and small nekton. So why were these tiny fish and shrimps and krill and things like that making this vertical migration? This is a place where I often pause the presentation and ask for student feedback and things like that. But I'll go ahead here now and give some of the common hypotheses for this. One is that it benefits these organisms to be near the surface where there's the most food. Why is there most food near the surface? That's because that's where the light is, and that's where the phytoplankton can grow. So the algal production is highest near the surface. And if you want to be where the delicious single-celled plants are growing, you need to be near the surface. But if you're near the surface during the daytime, larger predators may spot you and eat you. So you want to get out of there when the sun starts to rise so you can be hidden in the cover of darkness during the daytime. So you want to come up to the surface at night to feed on the phytoplankton there, but then sneak back down into the dark waters during the day to hide from potential predators. And then there's a third hypothesis for why it might benefit these organisms to migrate, and it's that the waters are colder deep down, and sort of by spending their sort of resting period during the daytime in the colder deep waters, they have a lower basal metabolic rate, and therefore they don't burn as much calories. So even though it costs them a lot of calories to swim up and down every 24 hours, that's balanced out by the energy savings that they get uh, hanging out in the colder waters during the daytime. So to a small organism, vertical migration is a really difficult journey. And it's not just because the relative distance is large, it's because there are these sort of physical changes in um, sort of the way that the fluid medium is perceived by these small organisms relative to the way larger organisms can sort of pass easily through the fluid medium. And these sort of like differences in the physics of swimming for small versus large organisms were characterized by this uh, Irish physicist Osborne Reynolds, and he came up with this equation, which I think I'm not sure he named it after himself, but somebody named it after him. They call it the Reynolds number, abbreviated R, capital R, lowercase e. And it's basically a ratio of inertial forces to viscous forces. So viscous forces are like the thickness of the water and how difficult it is to swim through the water. And the inertial forces are sort of like the momentum and speed of the object that's passing through the water. So if you've got a high ratio of inertial forces to viscous forces, it means that some object is just spearing through the water really smoothly and rapidly. Whereas if you have a high ratio of viscous forces um, to the inertial forces, meaning that the fraction is a small number, Reynolds number is small, then that means it's very hard for that organism to get through the water because it's having to push aside the water particles, and it's really hard for it to like get through. So for a small organism with a small Reynolds number, the water is sort of stuck to it, and it has a hard time getting through the water. It almost has to like dig through the water more so than piercing the water. But for a large, fast organism with a large Reynolds number, the water sort of just ripples to the side, and the thing can pierce right through the water and slide along easily. So there's a whole spectrum of different Reynolds numbers based on the sizes and swimming speeds of different organisms. Um, and it really sort of dictates their lifestyle and how they can swim through the water. So a small flagellated cell like a sperm cell has a very, very small Reynolds number, and it's basically like burrowing through the water. Water is very viscous to such a small organism. Something that's a little bit bigger, like a mesozooplankton, like a copepod, water is still quite viscous to it, and so a copepod, it doesn't smooth swimmingly through the water. It has to sort of move in little jerks, jerking its way through the water through flips of its antenna. A minnow has a Reynolds number that's sort of in the intermediate range, and so it's not able to like glide really gracefully through the water. It has to flick its little tail pretty rapidly to move, but it's kind of on the cusp of being able to glide through the water versus having to sort of burrow through the water. A person swimming does glide through the water. We're not very streamlined, but we do have a large Reynolds number, and that allows us to sort of, um, streamline ourselves and cut through the water decently well when we're swimming. But then, like the masters of cutting through the water and gliding through the water would be large organisms like a blue whale, which has a very large Reynolds number and is able to sort of very smoothly and efficiently pass through the water at high speed. Okay, so moving on from the sort of physics and ecology of the pelagic environment, I now want to talk about human impacts to the pelagic environment. Basically, the pelagic environment is this big environment that's far away from the shore where humans live, and yet humans have still found ways to really harm the pelagic environment. Our reach is long, and we've had major impacts on the pelagic environment through overfishing, pollution, species introductions, noise and collisions made from our activities on the pelagic environment, and climate change, which is sort of this planetary scale change, which is affecting the pelagic along with the rest of the planet. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these things. Overfishing in the pelagic environment is pervasive. There's far fewer fish in the pelagic ocean than there were just in the mid 20th century, like 10% or even just down to 1% or less of some of the populations of pelagic fishes that used to be widespread, because we now have the technology for fishing boats to get literally anywhere on the ocean. So there's no part of the ocean ecosystem that has not been subjected to intense fishing. These are tuna, pelagic species of pelagic fish. Well, I mean, it's several species there's many species of tuna, but they're one of the common pelagic fishes that's overfished throughout the world. The thing about pelagic fishing is potentially it could be sustainable. So in the coastal environment near shore, fishing has a lot of environmental risks, such as habitat destruction when the nets scrape across the bottom, and fish populations tend to be more small and localized near the coast, so it's easy to like deplete the fish from a certain area if you're fishing near the coast. Whereas in the pelagic ocean, even though fish life isn't as dense, it's really spread out, and the populations are sort of large and diffuse, and so that makes them potentially gives them the opportunity to escape fishing and be able to recover from fishing and stuff. And you can catch those fish without scraping your nets on the bottom in the pelagic. So potentially you could fish the pelagic sustainably. In reality, though, we tend to overfish the pelagic environment. Um, and some of the reasons that overfishing happens in the pelagic environment is because a lot of the fish that we're trying to catch out there are K-selected species. K-selected species are large, slow-growing species with long lifespans and slow reproduction, like sharks and tuna and whales, and they just can't sustain a heavy harvest and replenish themselves. Another thing is that the methods that we use for fishing in the pelagic environment, even though they don't scrape on the bottom and disrupt the bottom environments like coastal fishing do, they have their other problems. Like um, the one of the methods that we use is drift nets, which are really long nets that are stretched along the surface of the water, and they sort of passively ensnare everything. So that includes sea turtles and seabirds and sharks and dolphins, as well as whatever fish or squid are being targeted by those drift nets. And then long lines have a similar problem. So a long line is like a long fishing line supported by buoys that's stretched out behind the boat. And then it's got lots and lots of hooks that come off of that long line, and there can be thousands of hooks. But who knows what's going to bite those hooks? Hopefully, it's the type of fish that you're going for, but it could be a sea turtle or a seabird that will drown when it gets hooked on there, unless you immediately remove it from the hook. So there's a lot of problems with bycatch in these fisheries, and one of the worst things is that since the seas are sort of rough and stormy, these fishing devices can break off from the boat, and then they're just drifting through the ocean, but they're continuing to kill things, and they can get wrapped up around marine birds and mammals and entangle them. Many whales end up with fishing gear wrapped around their tails and eventually eats into the flesh of the tails. And so they call that ghost fishing, where the debris from the fishing is continuing to kill things in the pelagic environment, even beyond its intended purpose. Um, and managing fishing in the pelagic environment is really difficult because it's far from shore, far from the law enforcement, and oftentimes it's in these international waters which are not owned by anybody in particular, or their ownership is sort of under dispute, and so it's hard to make and enforce laws governing fishing in the open ocean far from shore. Another problem is, setting limits on how many fish can be caught is tough, because a lot of times we don't know what the normal historical amounts of those fish were. Also, maybe it's one species of fish, but it covers the population stretches across the whole ocean, and different nations are catching those fish, and it's just really, really hard to regulate that kind of activity. This is a picture of a unfortunate sea turtle that is ensnared in a drift net that's gotten loose. So pollution in the pelagic environment is a thing, and it's maybe not as noticeable as pollution near shore, like near the sources of pollution, but there's a lot of pollution that moves long distances through the environment and affects the pelagic environment, even though it's far from shore. So pollution from rivers and runoff does eventually make its way into the ocean and then is mixed by ocean currents out into the pelagic. Um, uh, Air pollution can be deposited into the ocean, so clouds of pollution when it rains, that can be sort of like introduced into the water as those particles of pollution are brought down by that precipitation. And then discharges from ships. So ships that dump their trash or that spill oil or fuel out into the ocean can pollute the pelagic ocean. Uh, and there's a lot of different types of harmful substance released into the pelagic environment that we can consider pollution. Plastic is one of the worst types because it, it persists for a long enough time that even if it's produced somewhere else, it can eventually oftentimes make its way into the um, uh, oceanic pelagic environment. Other types of pollutants that last a long time, like persistent organic pollutants, which mean like synthetic chemicals made by humans that last a long time in the environment and cause harmful effects in the marine food chain get out there. Heavy metals like mercury tend to accumulate, and we'll learn more about this when we talk more specifically about pollution, but the food chain has a way of sort of concentrating the pollution into the from the lower trophic levels into the upper trophic levels. So by the time you get to a top trophic level fish like a swordfish, it has a really high concentration of pollution in its tissues, and that's why there's sometimes warnings against pregnant women eating tuna or swordfish because it has such a high concentration of various marine pollutants like mercury or persistent or organic pollutants of various kinds like PCBs. Um, and then nutrients like nitrogen oxides, they're mainly a pollution problem in coastal waters where excess nutrients get in the water and it fuels harmful algae blooms. But this is problem has become so big that I think it's affecting the oceanic environment as well. We've seen increases in the amounts of sargassum, for example, above the natural historic levels. And this indicates that the open ocean, which is normally a low nutrient environment, is becoming richer in nutrients, and that's upsetting the balance of the ecosystem and resulting in larger amounts of algae that don't always have positive effects. Um, and I mentioned the biological interactions where sort of the transfer up the food chain from small fish to larger predatory fish sort of concentrates the pollutions and makes the pollution problems worse. One of the things that makes the pollution problems, the global scale of ocean pollution problems really obvious is if you ever go to a really isolated patch of shoreline or an isolated island, you'd think you'd be far away from the influence of pollution, but you'll actually see more trash on the beaches of that isolated island or isolated patch of coastline than you would on the heavily populated beach. And the reason is because if it's a beach like that's frequented by visitors in a tourist area like Miami Beach or something, then there's beach patrols and paid people that pick the trash off the beach and cart it away and put it in garbage cans and things like that. But if you're in an isolated natural area, then the trash just accumulates and accumulates and accumulates, and the beaches of what would be like the most pristine, beautiful places of the world are now covered in trash. And it's really unfortunate for wildlife because there are many types of wildlife that can't distinguish between the trash and their food sources, and they'll end up ingesting trash and dying either from their guts physically being clogged or from toxic chemicals that leach from the trash that they consume. And then the trash breaks down in the sun and the waves. It breaks into little bits called microplastics, which are which really easily enter the food chain and cause a variety of toxic effects. So plastic pollution is a big, big deal in the ocean that we're going to be dealing with for generations to come. Something that is also an environmental impact that doesn't usually affect the pelagic environment but can be a problem is introduction of non-native species. So the reason introduction of non-native species is not usually a problem in the pelagic environment is because the pelagic environment is already very interconnected from one part of the world to the next. So there's not many species existing in the pelagic that um, like for the most part, the species that could live in the pelagic environment are already there. But there are some cases where a species that was not originally in that chunk of the pelagic environment got introduced from somewhere else. And one of the examples is with this ctenophore, a type of comb jelly, a primitive phyla of gelatinous organisms, was introduced from the Atlantic Ocean into the Black Sea in um, Central Europe, and they caused big problems there because these things eat other zooplankton, like including fish larvae. So they really disrupted the food chain by taking away the prey of the fish larvae and also eating the fish larvae. And one of the ironic things that began to bring this non-native species introduction under control was that there was another species of ctenophore that ate this species of ctenophore that got introduced to that environment. And it was kind of a case of two wrongs make a right because that second species of ctenophore, which was named Beroe, actually sort of helped bring down the numbers of the first invader. So it doesn't always work out conveniently like that, but that is how it worked out in that case. A really sad human impact on the marine environment is noise pollution. So you may have noticed this if you were ever snorkeling or swimming underwater and you heard motorboat noise. It's really loud and it travels long distances underwater. And this creates sort of this condition of chronic noise pollution where organisms which depend on sound for their own communication are now having a harder time communicating and detecting uh, predators and prey and other members of their species against this noisy background of man-made sound like motorboat engines and the noises of undersea mining and other human activities in the ocean. So this sort of chronic, it's too loud to communicate or hear predators or prey problem is called chronic noise pollution. There's also a worse kind of noise pollution called acute noise pollution, where the noises are so loud that they're actually physically damaging to the organisms and can literally kill the organisms or deafen them, which indirectly kills them. So there's a few things that humans do that create these super duper loud sounds. One of them is called LF active sonar. It stands for low frequency active sonar. So that's in contrast with passive sonar. Passive sonar is where there's basically just microphones underwater that are listening for the sounds of submarines and things like that. Active sonar, it actually makes pings or it actually makes sounds that bounce off of things. And then the echoes that return help the people on the ship visualize the underwater environment, like where the bottom is, where other boats or fishes or whales or whatever is in the water. And the low frequency active sonar is used to detect like enemy submarines in the area. The thing is, it makes such loud sounds that it will kill all of the marine mammals in the vicinity of the low frequency active sonar. So there's really like no safe place in the world to use this without killing all of the marine mammals in the area. So um, there have been some efforts to have international treaties banning the use of this, similar to our treaties that ban the use of nuclear weapons, sort of something that's done in recognition that, you know, we have this technology, we could use it, but we agree as the human race that we're not going to do this because the consequences for our lives and the environment are just too bad. So that's the policy that I would support personally. Another, pervasive impact from human activity in the pelagic environment is ship strikes. So the diagram here shows sort of a heat map of shipping traffic across the world's oceans. So you can see areas that are crisscrossed by shipping traffic frequently have these sort of red and orange colors, and areas that aren't as often crossed by ships have blue or white. White's where no ships have crossed those areas. And one of the things that you might notice is that there's really, really intense shipping traffic in some coastal areas, like around coastal Europe and the coast of the United States and the Caribbean. And these coastal areas are also the areas that are most productive in terms of primary and secondary production, and that's where marine life tends to congregate. So it's this unfortunate situation where our most intense boat traffic is sometimes right in the areas where there's the most biological activity. And these big boats move extremely fast, much faster than most marine organisms can swim. And so even fast swimming organisms like baleen whales will end up getting struck and killed by boats that are blasting through the ocean. One of the ways that we can reduce mortality from ship strikes is by having speed limits for boats in areas where we know that there's large amounts of whales congregating, and or having detection systems where when whales are detected in the area, a warning goes out to all the boats that they have to reduce their speed to avoid hitting the whale. So this is a problem that could potentially be reduced by policies and technologies that reroute ships or change the speeds of ships in areas where ship strikes are likely. Uh, One of the most pervasive influences on the marine pelagic environment that humans have, been involved in is changing the ocean climate. So climate change, which you've probably heard about in your other classes, this sort of man-made influence on the climate related to increasing concentrations of atmospheric greenhouse gases. It not only changes the mean temperature on Earth, but it changes sort of the wind and ocean current patterns, and that strongly affects how things like heat are distributed in different parts of the oceans, where upwelling occurs, where nutrients are brought to the surface of the pelagic environment. It changes a lot, and it's particularly noticed from year to year, month to month, and over the long term, it's been changing as well. One of the natural fluctuations in ocean conditions that's most famous is the El Nino La Nina cycle. El Nino cycle being when there's very little upwelling and there's warm, nutrient-poor waters in the um, eastern Pacific Ocean, and then La Nina being the more typical conditions where there's strong upwelling and polar currents, which bring cold water, nutrient rich in nutrients to the surface here, and that's good for the phytoplankton productivity and the fisheries and the food chains in this area. So El Nino is kind of bad because you have this warm, stagnant water that has low nutrients in it and low productivity, and La Nina is a more desirable situation, but sort of like the flip-flopping back and forth between El Nino and La Nina has gotten more extreme and more frequent as the climate has changed, and so it's one of the ways that man-made climate change is really disrupting the natural cycles of the ocean. Another sort of potential worrisome change in the ocean environment that might result from climate change is a change in the what we call the thermohaline circulation or the global ocean conveyor belt. So this is sort of like the long, slow pattern of overturning of the ocean where the warm surface waters in certain parts of the world they sink to the bottom as they cool, and then the cool waters meander around the world until they upwell in certain places and are eventually warmed again, and sort of refreshes the deep waters of the ocean with oxygen acquired from waters that were at the surface. And it's important in sort of the oxygen and chemical cycle of the ocean, as well as in the cycles of nutrient delivery and upwelling. So the global thermohaline circulation is a very important system that also affects the climate by, for example, delivering heat from tropical areas to cold areas. It's getting disrupted by climate change. For example, where the Greenland ice sheet is melting, it's making the North Atlantic fresher, and the cooling and sinking of surface waters is not happening as much there as it used to, and so there's concern that that might slow down or shut down the thermohaline circulation. So, and that would sort of lead to ripple effects through the oceans throughout the world. So there's potential for these weird ripple effects of climate change to disrupt ocean life and climate as a result of climate change stressors.